Alexei Likhachov, who's spoken recently, and he's mentioned the dream strategy shared by the contemporary youth, as well as by our whole civilized community, dreaming of a better development of the society, in particular of a better development in education. So one of the global goals we've got to reach by 2050 is happiness for everyone. Well, I believe it's at all times been a global goal for everyone, but let me start with a very generic question. I'm exceptionally interested in your opinions about this. Now, given the current setup in our today's setting, in terms of your professional experience, how do you think this happiness can be encouraged by arts, culture, and science? Well, actually, there is a very direct link, I believe. Let me take you back to 7 years ago. Remember, there was this well-known Serov exhibition, and there was this very long waiting line to get in. And I'm so much ashamed about it right now. In 2015, back then, we were unable to receive hundreds of people to view the exhibition, so they had to freeze out there in winter for 2 hours and more to get in and see the paintings. And in fact, when I had to come out and meet those who were getting in through the entrance for the officials, I had to apologize. And everybody said, well, look, that was not an easy and a warm experience, but at least after that turmoil, we had 2 or 3 hours of pure distilled happiness to experience. And that was the answer I did not coin. In fact, it was shaped and proposed by the viewers we're working for. An arts museum is there to make people happy. Sergey. They say too much knowledge is about too much sadness.
I'm a great proponents of how the Chinese define happiness, and what they say that happiness is when you have who to love, what to do, and what to hope for. I think that's an exceptional maxim, and education and culture gives us who to love, what to do, and what to hope for. They give us all of that. So these three components, culture, science, and education, and the business, for that matter, are the integral parts of what makes people lead meaningful lives and do what they find exciting. And I guess the topic of bringing these aspects together dates back to 1950s. There was a prominent English physicist and writer who gave a lecture titled Two Cultures. And he paid attention to the fact that the humanitarian culture and the scientific culture diverge, and people stop understanding each other. And since that time, we had a third culture emerge, and that's the business culture. And I guess it's important for us now that those who represent those three cultures keep in touch to prevent a further divergence of these cultures. And yes, I did attend the exposition of Serov's paintings, and I do understand how Mr. Gulova says that she wants to bring happiness in our life through art. Art fosters intuition. Art is about learning the world through intuition, unlike science. And it's important that the people of the future had both the techniques at hand, and it's only possible if you are brought up in a particular way. And this formation, that's education, regardless of who you want to become, whether a physicist or else, you can't be removed from the culture.
Even more so that you are perhaps the best expert on how you find the right equilibrium, how do you strike the balance between maths and humanities. I mean, your doctorate thesis was in physics and maths, but in fact your PhD was about the history of science, right? Which has a very strong touch in humanities, right? Well, actually, recently, we've witnessed multiple new challenges for everyone. In fact, they are challenging our intuition, our intellectual curiosity, and our plan for the future. I believe there used to be in the past some kind of global plan. I mean, some kind of global agenda, if you wish. Everyone had a rough idea and understanding of the possible development and of the possible track to follow and path to take. Well, now we're living in a time of turmoil, of great turbulence. They are saying any crisis is a window of opportunities. But in your opinion, have the challenges changed in education, and has the societal demand changed in terms of what they want to get from education and whether the education offers them a way to form their future?
Конечно.
I guess there has been a change. But what concerns me is that what is being discussed today, it seems, is only the education for the young. But then there is the lifelong learning, which has become a very habitual expression. I keep learning, even though I'm far from my youth and have been for a long time. So this need for lifelong learning is something that has emerged as a need. And that education goes into much more mature ages. And according to demographers, Generation Z has a good probability to live to 100 years, and that means that people would work longer, but also study longer. The second thing that has changed is this. There is quite a dangerous trend of making education over-pragmatic. When people want very early on to focus on a very narrow area of knowledge and get a very hands-on profession. And why I believe that is dangerous? Because the world is evolving very fast, and jobs and professions would evolve very fast. And it may well be that the jobs that the people get when they are in their 17 or 18 up to 25 may no longer be there when they are 50. And if they live to 100 years, question becomes what they will do in the second half of their lives. And this is quite a challenging topic. So I believe that over-pragmatization of education is something that we want to step aside from. I want now to pass the baton, if you will, to Zelfira, because I believe that arts and culture, humanitarian culture, can largely address this topic of pragmatization education.
Would you agree? Yes, I do agree. I share this, but let me just take a second to get you back to what Sergei was talking about the interaction between science, culture, and business. Let me take you back again to the Serov exhibition, and in fact to all the exhibitions and expositions and the educational and editorial programs performed by the Tretyakov Gallery. Over the past 8 years, I have headed it. All of this has been funded by the Russian business community, each and every bit of it, which demonstrates a very powerful kind of collaboration with the business community, who are not only the source of funding for us, but also who are extremely like-minded, and to whom it's not just about corporate social responsibility. It's not about philanthropy, which is something they have to engage into because it's commissioned top-down, but also it's the like-minded individuals who completely share their understanding of how significant this is for the future of this country. I entirely agree with you in that we should not limit ourselves to talking only and solely about the youth. Over the past years, we've been doing a lot of work to enlarge the age range of our visitors, because in the 80s, they used to be the third age people, which was clearly visible from the data from the ticket office. In fact, the laws are such that women aged 55 go and apply for a retirement benefit as she reaches the respective age. So I know exactly how it worked. Well, now the trend is downright different, but it's not because we now have fewer retired visitors. It's because we've grown a huge young audience of visitors. And here we're coming back to the challenges of our today's setup. You see, the horror we experienced in 2020, and you ought to understand that the staff of the museums are usually very sentimental. They are passionate. Usually it's all female teams. At the Tretyakov Gallery, we have 1,500 staff members. We stayed closed for 5.5 months. In 2019, we received about 3 million visitors, and the non-budget funded amount of our work totaled 63%. That is, only 30% was the funding we received from the government. That was a whole new experience for us. We were closed down. We had no visitors. We had all kinds of restrictions during the pandemic. So what do? How do you keep 1,500 staff members busy for almost half a year? I mean, of course, the security staff were there in the museum on a daily basis, but how do we get to keep them busy so that they don't get demotivated? And then we made a huge leap forth. We launched all kinds of online programs. We created 2 fantastic different movies with the support of the Sberbank. It's Tretyakovka, the Tretyakov Gallery with Sergei Shnurov, and the Tretyakov Gallery with Konstantin Habensky. And we also generated lots of fantastic educational programs. In fact, we were in meticulous search throughout 2020 for a new language we could use with our audience that would be bright, outstanding, vivid, and that would not be way too populist, because art critics are actually very boring. They're tedious people doing some tedious writing. It's hard to work through their usual professional speak. So when the museum was reopened on the 22nd of January in 2021, following the second lockdown, we saw a huge influx of the audience, and we welcomed a completely new audience. So this new audience were the visitors we reached out to online throughout 2020. At the same time, we never lost the previous viewers we traditionally used to receive prior to 2015. A few words about yet another challenge we are experiencing these days in 2022. Well, naturally, over the past several years, we've done an awful lot to promote the Russian arts worldwide. And it's not only about the Russian icons and the Russian avant-garde painting, which were very well known already. I'm also referring to the arts and the painting of the 19th century. It took a whole different approach to the analysis and the representation of this art globally. Luckily, we've been through a lot of exhibitions we've done over the past years, and naturally our exhibitions abroad were mirrored in our projects, whereby we invited exhibitions from the top world museums. Naturally, in 2022, we had to revisit all our exhibition plans because all our major large-scale ambitious projects were about cooperation with international museums, with foreign museums, and that's important. In fact, I was very fearful. I was afraid I was going to lose my staff. People would get depressed and demotivated. Well, no, they went out of their way to think out of the box, to create the exhibitions, to gather more people. In fact, we are completing this year with about 2 million visitors who've attended our exhibitions and who've been through our activities and education activities in particular. Now, a few words about education and about what an art museum can do to develop education through master classes, exhibitions, educational programs, through creative workshops. It boosts creativity. Now, the future is with the nations that focus on developing creativity. It doesn't really matter what becomes of a human being professionally further on. If somebody is used to going to see a museum, to experiencing arts firsthand, if someone is used to experiencing artistic practices, he will be as creative in his further professional life as what he has seen around him. Indeed, so education has to be adaptable, and creative. In fact, adaptation, I believe, is the key word for the world we're living in today. Now, going back to the youth, going back to educating young people, I believe a more mature person who is continuing learning, I believe, tends to be in the track he chooses with full awareness of the steps he's taking. A younger person is a different story. I mean, I'm a mother of a 17-year-old who is facing the first important choice in his life, and I see how tough it is. His priorities change, his wishes change, his plans for the future are changing. I mean, we've revisited the plans so many times already, and there is no end to it. And on the one hand, it's fantastic. It's fabulous because a crisis is always an impetus for growth. It's where you discover and explore your own creativity and you become very resourceful. At the same time, it's really tough when it comes to deciding what path one should be taking. In Scandinavian schools, they try and work with each and every child so that the children get guided. I mean, they make sure the strongest children don't dominate and the weaker ones get more support. So they develop their e intellectual, emotional intellect, and their ability to interact. In Asia, they single out the strongest, the ones who stand out, and the most diligent and hardworking ones. In the United States, they focus tremendously on the social part of living a life. It's about choosing an insurance company or hitting the right marriage contract. In Russia, what do you think should be our concept of education? Where do you think we could borrow some role model? Whether we have some unique educational strategy we could share with the world?
We have always had such a strategy to start with. And the strategy was to have a fundamental education. And I guess this is something that we want to keep, at least in my view. When we hear that education should be like this or like that, well, it takes all sorts of education to make an education. We want to have inclusive schools, yes. We want to have specialized schools, by all means. We want to have specialized schools for talented kids. And everything that I achieved in life was because I graduated from a specialized school, a very famous one in Moscow, 2 years before it was disbanded. And then among the graduates of that school, or specialized schools, we have sculptors, we have painters, we have scientists and scholars. And it's a good example of how fundamental education lets individuals to get very different professions. But when a whole country makes it a point to teach children on how to do law and make contracts, well, you would end up with a nation of lawyers, and lawyers are important. That's true. But you only need so many of them. If you don't know math, if you can't develop technology beyond that, you may come across a big problem. And I guess in Russia, we want to keep education fundamental. Let's look at other nations. China, for example. I was an scientific editor of a book on education in China, and there it's a tradition that children do their homework together at school, and the Minerva awards for discoveries in education, similar to the Nobel Prize, was awarded for the discovery of a method that is called peer instruction. That's learning from your peers. And the essence of the method is as follows. If peers discuss something, a problem, they can explain some difficult topics to each other better than perhaps a tutor. In psychology, there is this notion of the knowledge curse. And it's about this. When an individual stays in a certain conceptual field for too long, they may fail to remember what difficulties they had to overcome when they were mastering that field. And often they find it hard to convey this or impart this on an individual who is fresh to the industry. And your peer has just overcome a difficulty. It's fresh in their minds. They had an insight and they know what words to use to impart this knowledge on their peer. So I guess this is not just a social habit of the Chinese people to do the homework together, but also it's quite well rooted in psychology. And why don't we, for example, implement this in the Russian school practice? I don't see any bad or strange thing about it. So I think that we don't want to rush to some polar solutions. The world is globalizing, and so is education. I think that some graduates of Russian schools might and should continue their education abroad internationally. If we were to continue to build a closed education system, it would be very difficult for them to join those different systems. So I'm really a proponent of a multifaceted approach in education.
May I take a few minutes to add a couple of things? I entirely share Sergei's opinion on the fundamental nature of education that's necessary. I would say what's necessary is the universal education. My school was a specialized one in Riga, not in Moscow, and it was the best school of Riga, and it still is. Now, then I studied at the Faculty of History at the Moscow State University, specializing in arts and art history. And then I did my PhD in this. And in fact, working on multiple international exhibition projects, I've experienced that the universal nature of education, which was the strongest feature of the Soviet educational system. So when you inside out the Altamir caves throughout modernism and contemporary art, but then the latter we had to study firsthand in the 90s and in the beginning of the 21st century. And I believe we really ought to preserve this universal approach to education because it gives you a completely different outlook on things. In fact, I've experienced the following. My foreign colleagues usually ask me, did you graduate from Oxford or Yale? When they listened to my presentation, my addresses, and in fact, I always referred them back to the Moscow State University. In fact, the Soviet academic school was quite hierarchy, was quite well structured, and ours today continues being it. So I believe we ought to make sure we don't suppress creativity. We don't suppress personal take on things. I believe we ought to encourage this, but at the same time, we ought to continue being flexible, having in the same class very talented, outstanding children, and children who are not doing that well, who are not performing that well, or with children who simply don't want to study enough to move on. My daughter, in fact, graduated from the Moscow State University. She got a degree in arts. So I had this enfant terrible. She went to wash the floors at the Moscow State Art Center. And then a couple of months later, she came to see me and said, I do want a degree in arts. I want to be an art critic. And in fact, supporting creativity and supporting all kinds of choices is important. In fact, the Soviet education was indeed very universal. In fact, I studied in a small provincial mining town, and then I studied at the Moscow State University, and I am delighted to have made this educational choice, and I'm happy to be quite well educated, well versed, and well informed. You talked about personal growth and development. And indeed, I also think when I was at school, our goal was to get a good job, to learn to become a good professional, and to find ways to be fulfilled. I believe today the demand is quite different, and I believe today what's expected of an individual is much broader. It's about agency, it's about being free, it's about making your free choices in your life. It's about being free in moving around and choosing where you want to go and where you want to be. But at the same time, in this huge, very busy informational space, it's really tough tracking these trajectories and finding your path. So I believe it's not only important that we develop creative thinking, I believe we also ought to focus on developing critical thinking. To what extent do you think, and how should the education go about responding to this contemporary demand of agency, of professional independence, of manipulations, independence of trends and crisis of any kind of economic and political and policy changes we're all susceptible to at all times? I mean, we want stability, we want sustainability. Now, is it a matter of education or of values?
Во-первых, я всегда нервничаю.
You know, I'm almost always a bit nervous when people say that we want to develop, we want to have freedom of choice, we want to change jobs and professions, on the one hand. On the other hand, we want stability. To that, I always want to say, which of these do you want more? And so, do you want something stable or sustainable? Do you want something stable, or do you want the other things that you have mentioned? I do agree with Zulfira that we've got to give people an opportunity to develop. Ultimately, the education that an individual gets, the quality of it, is largely driven by the individual themselves. Good education can only be received when you have the inner motivation for it. If it's not there, then regardless of how fantastic the outer facade of the learning process is, you wouldn't get much of a result. So you want to give individuals an opportunity, and whether they take up that opportunity, it is up to the individual to realize. Creativity is very important, but I don't see any contradiction between creativity and critical thinking.
Это две стороны.
I believe it's two sides of the same coin. And
They must be. Critical thinking is a skill, a meta skill, if you will, that consists of many smaller skills that sadly not all people have, and that's certainly an area for development. And I guess what could be useful for our schools, that would be the development of critical thinking. That is beyond doubt. But that is quite a challenge. To teach children critical thinking, teachers must have critical thinking, and they haven't been taught. So there are some challenges here. And I guess it deserves a bigger project to do that. So I think that the nexus between critical thinking and creative thinking is what brings.
Конечно.
So this is what creates a good outcome if you're motivated. Indeed.
Уже человек тогда.
Indeed, and then a person will be good to go in this world.
Я бы
I would be quite concise on this. I believe what today is termed as critical thinking is exactly kind of vaccine, if you wish, that the Soviet school never presented. In fact, we were not mature enough when we left the Soviet school, so we had to grow to developing this critical thinking much later throughout our after-school experience. I mean, I'm referring to an experience of ages ago now, but I believe it's important not to be overly dogmatic these days. I believe we all ought to teach analysis. The first time we got exposed to this kind of teaching was at the university. We never, ever experienced it at school. And I hope today we have an opportunity to change the way it is. And I believe we really ought to get our today's school children to think independently and to do their own analysis. I mean, we work a lot on inclusive progress to reach out to autistic children and to the Down syndrome children. And we completely understand how it works cohesively. That is how things can be developed if taken in an integrated fashion. In fact, a museum is not an educational institution, but nevertheless, we have a lot of experience in this area, which also feeds into our work with the healthy individuals and with the healthy children without any special needs. Well, we're running out of time. I am not sure this is going to be a question you can answer briefly, but let me try. You mentioned personal motivation. How do you develop that? Where do you get it from? I mean, how do you turn it on in the human beings we are today?
Очень люблю одно четверостишье.
I like a poem by Samuel Marshak, a prominent Soviet poet, that he didn't dare to publish while he was alive, and they found it later in his notebooks. And it's a poem about a child. So this child keeps asking a question, why? And he was called a little philosopher. But once he grew up, when he started finding answers without questions. And after that, he never asked the question, why? So here's my answer. This is what you don't want to do to keep this personal inner motivation.
Zilfera, what's your take on it? We always see a human being we are today is a consumer, constantly online in social networks, completely illiterate. Oftentimes, we make very poor public speakers today. And on the one hand, we seem to be saying that everyone has this liberty, this freedom to express oneself and to learn and to study, but not everyone actually goes ahead and does it. So how do you turn on the human beings we are today to make sure they develop their skills they naturally have that are inherent? In fact, that's a very important one. And as I was thinking of what I was going to talk about today, I was wondering whether this is feasible. And indeed, this is quite realistic. It's not that a 67-year-old is complaining here. I have kids and grandchildren. My daughter has given up on an outstanding career, and she's done a lot to make sure my 12-year-old grandson is a completely zealous ardent reader. I mean, he didn't know what an iPad is at all. He only got it in hand when he had to learn online. He is amazingly creative. He is an inventor. He creates languages and whole world thinking much out of the box. As to this inner motivation, indeed, we experienced the following. The graduates of the arts faculty of the Moscow State University are not at all good in putting together a text, a one-pager. I mean, they make grammar mistake. They cannot write a text that can be properly read and enjoyed. People don't read these days. They just collect the data from multiple sources in no time, and this prevents their thinking. This prevents their mind from getting the right training to actually produce coherent text. And this is where we come back to my story with the artistic impressions, which are so important. I mean, we'll only remain human beings, and we talked about 2050 today, right? Well, I believe it's quite obvious in 2050 I'm not going to be in this world. But what kind of human being is it going to be? Whether it's going to be a carrier of a humanistic culture, because today we see that intelligent parents, just to shut up the kid, give the child an iPad, and basically the child is seen around with the iPad as soon as he or she can hold things in their hands. So what we get out of this, we are not sure. So everything we're doing these days is done to make sure that the humanistic culture, the culture that has shaped a human being as a civilized being, can live on for as long as it can. I mean, you cannot be a citizen of your country unless you're part of its culture, unless you're unaware of your culture. And this makes you so much more vulnerable. You will just become an extension to your gadget. Thank you very much. Well, we've asked more questions than the answers we've shared, but I hope some most relevant things we've managed to articulate on how arts and science and research can join one another in ensuring happiness by 2050. Thank you.